Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our masterclass on securing your cyber kill chain. This is part 2 in our cyber kill chain series. And if you missed part 1, that recording is available on our website. And after this webcast, we'll be sending out the recording to part 2, as well as a link to watch part 1 so that you don't miss anything. We'll give it just another minute for everybody to join in, and then Rob and Graham can take it away.
Thank you, Carly. So just while everyone is coming on in, thank you very much for joining us today. We're extremely excited to show part 2 of this masterclass series of the cyber kill chain. We did say during the first one that there are actually other cyber kill chain processes available. We're focusing again today on the Lockheed Martin. We had about 75 requests to cover off the others. If we said the first time, if we get 100, we'll cover off the others because they are more complex and actually really interesting. So if anyone here wants us to cover off any of the other cyber kill chain processes in more detail, such as the MITRE, then we will do so. So as usual, I am joined today by a very special colleague, Graham, who has spent a long time planning for this masterclass series. We really love the feedback. Thank you so much to everybody that sent across suggestions for different masterclasses. We love to work with everybody and give as much education as possible. But Graham, did you want to introduce yourself and
Sure.
What we're going to do today?
Absolutely. So yeah, my name is Graham Brooks. I'm a cybersecurity analyst here at Syxsense, and today we're going to essentially be moving beyond the fundamentals of the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain into the application of that material. And I'm going to let Rob start us off by walking through some of the terminology that we discussed last time, and then we'll get into the detail.
Thanks, Graham. Once again, I'm Rob Brown. I'm head of customer success, and our managed services have been managing and securing our customers for over 15 years, and we have remediated over 100 million vulnerabilities worldwide. Okay, so what we want to do first is to introduce our terminology, because we are going to use a few terms that are very similar to those in security, in the security industry. And we just want to make sure that in reference to what we're covering today, that there is an understanding of what they actually mean. So if we said the threat actor used a known vulnerability to attack big corp's web servers, what we mean is the threat actor isn't necessarily always going to be someone that is trying to hack your environment, like a cyber terrorist or some criminal that is trying to exploit your environment for gain. The threat actor could actually be one of the good guys, where they call themselves white hat hackers and also cyber analysts working for bug bounty programs. But it is incredibly important, but these actors are actually looking for vulnerabilities to keep your environment safe, but also to exploit your environment as well. That is very important to understand, that not everyone that finds a vulnerability and publishes the code to exploit it is a bad actor. But with that data on the internet, the vulnerability, what we're going to talk about next, isn't necessarily patched. And actually, this is quite an interesting concept, because we all know about Patch Tuesday. We know Linux has packages that they release on a cadence. We sometimes forget that vulnerabilities aren't just resolved in a patch. Some vulnerabilities are OS configuration issues that aren't resolved with a patch yet. And unless you're using penetration tester experts, or whether you have a vulnerability scanning solution to find everything that actually is a known exploit or a known vulnerability, you shouldn't just rely on patch management alone. And of course, if the vulnerability is 0-day, and we're going to go into some of the details of these, if these vulnerabilities exist, it's incredibly important that you apply whatever the workaround is, or the patch, or you change you change your environment so that your environment is less likely to be exploited via that vulnerability. So super interesting. But today we're going to cover off the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, and I just love the name. I really do. Imagine each of these 7 pieces are a link in a chain. If we can remove one of those links, we effectively can stop an exploit in your environment. And the cyber kill chain is broken down into 3 sections, or 3 phases, and I'm going to cover these in a little bit of detail. Graham did a far better job in the first one, so I'm going to hopefully just cover off very quickly the 3 phases, starting with the pre-compromise. Now, there is a misconception that somebody is able just to hack your environment through the internet. That might be possible, but actually reconnaissance is very important for those threat actors. They're ping sweeping the internet. They don't know who you are. They just know that there's an IP address with an internet-facing server. They may be emailing mass distribution groups looking for out of offices. They're looking for email bounce backs. They're trying to gain data and intelligence that they can use in a exploit attack. When they know who they're going to attack, now they're going to design how. This is what we call the weaponization and delivery phase of the pre-compromise. When they can find servers on the internet, is it Windows? Is it Linux? Is it Apache? Is there a vulnerability that they might be able to use to exploit the server and gain access to it? This happens a lot. You obviously rely on firewalls, you rely on protecting your environment with patch management, but that pre-compromise is very important to have as secure as possible, because the next phase is where we call the compromise phase. They are able to exploit your environment. And again, there is a misconception that this happens quickly. This may not happen quickly. They may be inside your environment for months, maybe days. If we take the SolarWinds, for example, they were probably in that environment for close to half a year, working out how they were going to exploit the environment and to spread. What they ended up doing was adding payload into software. But imagine if this was a ransomware attack. They're not just going to attack one machine, they're going to try to cause the most damage possible. They're also going to leave breadcrumbs. This is terminology I've used several times, where if you find the internet port that was open during the pre-compromise becomes closed as a threat actor, you may leave yourself little bits of breadcrumbs, accounts you've made, other servers that are internet facing. You can use those devices to come back in. So even though they fix the first problem, they're able to get back in through the second. And that's what we call the compromise phase. The post-compromise phase is the most worrying for any IT director or CISO. Now they've got access to your environment. They've planned it. They know how to do it. They know where to do it. Now they know when to do it. And when that happens, as an IT department, as a company, you now have to be very careful in your next steps, potentially even making a public announcement to the internet that you've been exploited. And it's most important that you don't allow the post-compromise to go any further, because that's obviously where we have serious issues, and we hear it, your company name in the news. So that is a very, very brief example of the 3 phases of the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. Graham, I hope I did a good job. I'm going to pass it to you to walk us through one example, and we all know this example. And I still remember the day I saw the news that this happened. So I'm going to pass it to you, Graham, and yeah, and look forward to learning an awful lot today.
Thank you so much. That was a great summary. So with that in mind, we're going to take a deep dive into one of the worst cybersecurity attacks in history, WannaCry, which you can see the payload right there in front of you. What we're going to do, though, is take the WannaCry ransomware event and look at it through the lens of the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. Once we've walked through the cyber kill chain of WannaCry, we'll then show you how to protect your devices from this style of attack. But first, we kind of have to give you a little bit of the background. In May 2017, a group of state-sponsored hackers known as the Lazarus Group began deploying one of history's most successful crypto malware campaigns. By December of 2017, over 300,000 computers had fallen prey to WannaCry. According to CBS News, the devastation wrought by this attack cost upwards of $4 billion to remediate. So how did this start? How did it happen? And where are we going from here? Actually, it starts in the United States with the National Security Agency. If you attended last month's Masterclass, you might be a bit surprised to find the second stage, weaponization, listed first in our kill chain. Also, Rob just showed you, it always starts with Reconnaissance, so why are we here? It's intentional. See, the story of WannaCry is a little different than most cybersecurity events. Instead of a hacker using a known vulnerability to execute their payload, or a company being compromised by a bad password policy, WannaCry occurred because of a zero-day vulnerability. But not just any zero-day, a zero-day discovered by the NSA and then crafted into a powerful weapon to be used against organizations and countries antagonistic to the United States. So essentially, they took this vulnerability and they locked it away in their keep, and they just said, we're going to hold on to this in case we need it. They didn't alert Microsoft or anyone else to what they'd done. Well, sometime before April 14th, 2017, an illicit information brokerage called the Shadow Brokers released an ad on Twitter for a newly uncovered vulnerability, which they claimed to have procured through a leak within the NSA. This new vulnerability contained instructions on how to bypass Microsoft security functions and gain administrative access to devices without any user input over any network and without any required privileges. And to make it even worse, the leak contained a fully functioning, fully documented tool to weaponize the vulnerability provided by the NSA. So unlike most attacks, WannaCry started not with a search for targets to find exploits against, but rather a powerful weapon which could be used against almost any target. So after procuring the zero-day vulnerability and the weaponization vector from the shadow brokers, the Lazarus Group began the recon process. Their process had one simple requirement: scan as much of the internet as possible for accessible devices that have 445 and 139 ports open. If such a device is found, write down the device's IP address in a database for future reference, and then proceed on to the next target. Why ports 445 and 139? Well, because it's the communication ports for SMB. SMB stands for Secure Message Block and is the primary communications protocol between servers and clients in a Windows domain. With an SMB connection, users can access folders, files, mail slots, printers, and a whole lot more across their domain. It's a core communication mechanism of the Microsoft domain ecosystem. And with the weaponized vulnerability available to Lazarus, they would also have access to that same information if they could connect to an accessible device with internet-facing SMB ports. So, sometime between April 14th and May 12th, 2017, the Lazarus Group built a massive database of some 200,000 internet accessible SMB enabled endpoints. And on May 12th at 7:44 UTC, the attack went live. The name of the exploit, which the Lazarus Group used, was christened Eternal Blue by the National Security Agency back in the day when they found it and provided the functionality. Eternal Blue relied on a flaw in the SMB protocol, which would misinterpret a communication packet with just the right format. In this specific context, instead of auto-denying a connection request, this specially crafted packet would instead bypass all authentication mechanisms and provide the attacker with the ability to execute remote code as an admin on the endpoint. Once Eternal Blue gained access to a system, it then planted double pulsar, a backdoor mechanism also sold by the shadow brokers. This would be the cookie. Sorry, was that the word you used, the backdoor element in the pre-compromise and compromise portion?
The
Breadcrumb.
breadcrumbs.
That's
Yeah,
the
the
word you used.
breadcrumbs.
Yep.
Yeah.
So breadcrumbs, or in this case, I'm calling it a backdoor. Same idea. So they planted double pulsar as a breadcrumb into the systems that they were affecting using Eternal Blue. That allowed them to then re-access those devices without having to use their original method of exploitation. And then after implanting the double pulsar backdoor, Eternal Blue would then expand its presence. This process is called worming. Essentially what they were doing is they would use a device with Eternal Blue as a port scanner in the internal network. So we're no longer talking about the internet, we're talking about your corporate domain. And now on our one device that we've compromised, we now scan all of the other devices on your network. And if we find devices using SMB, which again, it's most of them, we're going to connect to those devices too. And then we put our double pulsar breadcrumb onto those new devices. And after we've done that, we have full command and control of your entire environment. There's a little bit of a useful key here though. Eternal Blue was really, really aggressive. It targeted hospitals, it targeted banks, it could target anything and everything within its reach, unless the device that it was trying to target was located in North Korea, which is actually why the United States government was able to track WannaCry to the Lazarus Group, because it's a North Korean entity. So we have this bigger picture of what's going on. Targeted deployments against everything unless it's in North Korea. So once Eternal Blue finished that worming process, the payload was ready to be initialized. And in fact, the Lazarus Group did do that on May 17th. Like most ransomware, WannaCry included decryption instructions, which would potentially allow impacted companies to decrypt the data for the small fee of $300 to $600 per device. But as with many ransomware campaigns, no one actually received their decryption keys after sending the fee to the Lazarus Group. Some security researchers believe that the ransomware attack wasn't intended to be a revenue generation event. If it was actually a major failure. Only $300,000 worth of ransoms were paid out in the attack, which is a fraction of some of the more targeted events that we've seen more recently. Instead, it's thought that WannaCry was intended to be the equivalent of a cyber dirty bomb. Drop the payload and cause as much damage as is possible. And the damage could have been even worse if not for the hard work of thousands of security researchers, most notably 22-year-old hacker Marcus Hutchins, who was able to use that information around the North Korea connection to discover a kill switch in the WannaCry execution process. This kill switch was designed to discover safe word DNS entries within the victim's network. And if discovered, Eternal Blue would, instead of executing the worm payload, it would just stop and say, okay, this isn't a relevant device, move on to the next. After that kill switch was made public by Marcus, the Lazarus Group released a new version of their exploit using a different kill switch, which then other researchers were able to figure out. And then finally, the Lazarus group released a version with no kill switch. But by the time the final version was released, most of the malware's targets had either already been infected or the target systems had been hardened against SMB version 1 attacks. So in all, some 200 to 300,000 endpoints were completely wiped. Over $4 billion in damages were recorded. And lest you think that this is a story from 2017, in 2019, WannaCry was recorded as the #1 ransomware attack, 2 years after the original attack happened. And now, 6 years later, WannaCry is still in the top 10 most common malware infections discovered by antivirus. So now we know the story of WannaCry. We have the full kill chain. And because we know the kill chain, we know how to break that chain, specifically in that pre-compromise phase. When they're trying to find devices on the network that they can impact, we stop them from finding us because we disable SMB version 1. It's that simple. But sometimes it's also not that simple. Imagine a manufacturing organization. Many of these companies have hundreds or thousands of computers tied to multi-million-dollar part picking machines, industrial printers, welders, or die casters. It's not uncommon for those machines, sometimes costing millions of dollars each, to be 10 or 20 years old and rely on SMB version 1. In this situation, it would be irresponsible to simply turn off SMB version 1. It would kill the production of that company. But it's equally dangerous to leave the devices exposed. And that is the complex world of cybersecurity risk management, which we'll talk through briefly now. So when we talk about managing vulnerabilities on a device or on a network, it's crucial that we understand the risk posed by the vulnerability. Every organization will have a different risk relationship with every vulnerability. Right now, we're looking at the security risk profile map. This is a tool for determining the priority of a vulnerability in an environment. If we apply the eternal blue vulnerability to this map, we can get interesting results. So let's take the example of most of those companies in 2017 with lots of exposed devices with SMB version 1 ports. In that particular context, this risk map would put us in that red corner in the upper right. Catastrophic impact, very high probability. Any company which doesn't take those kinds of vulnerabilities seriously, I would call negligent. But at the other end, imagine a company with a few employees, no domain, no SMB file share. The impact would be marginal and the probability would be very low. There's no reason to care about the same high priority vulnerability because the priority of that vulnerability changes based off of your environment. So looking at the map at large, you can see 3 distinct regions. The light blue represents vulnerabilities which deserve your attention because all vulnerabilities deserve your attention. They need to be classified and recorded, but they might not require action. The dark blue region represents vulnerabilities which need remediation or removal. And the purple represents vulnerabilities which should be removed if possible. Cutting between the purple regions and the dark blue regions is the organizational risk tolerance line. This line's placement can vary from organization to organization and context to context and represents the point at which a security team determines whether or not to take action on a potential threat. In a future webcast, we'll actually go into significantly more detail on the process of quantifying and qualifying organizational risk. But for now, just be aware that there is more to understanding a vulnerability than its CVSS score. There's the applied risk to your organization, industry, and vertical. And just as there's multiple ways to classify the priority of a risk, there's also multiple ways to respond to the priority of a risk beyond simply removing it. When possible, we always recommend to simply avoid the risk associated with the vulnerability by removing it. For some, this is the solution to SMB version 1. Just turn off the service and move on. But it's not always an option. Remember our manufacturing example. In that context, removal itself would require you to go through that organizational risk profile. You'd have to establish, do I kill my company by disabling this? So instead, for those organizations, mitigation makes more sense. Mitigation is often a lot more complex and time-consuming, though, than simply removing the threat. For our manufacturing example, this will likely involve the creation of complex firewall rules, bastion hosts, SDN profiles, and so much more work just to make sure that SMB traffic is limited, logged, and contained. Now, if the risk is below your organization's risk tolerance, it might make sense to offload that risk through a cybersecurity insurance policy. If your risk profile is understood correctly, this can be an appropriate money and time-saving mechanism for your team. If you have limited cybersecurity manpower, you won't have as much time to chase after every potential risk. So transferring those low priority issues to a security policy can be an appropriate management mechanism. And finally, some vulnerabilities, specifically the ones in that lower left-hand quadrant, are fine to just leave in place because of their low impact to your organization. Every organization is unique. Every cybersecurity policy should be tailored to the unique organization which it's applied to. So with that in mind, we're going to transition over to the Syxsense console, and I'm going to show you how we can manage the SMB vulnerability as it's applied to our manufacturing example.
Yeah. Just before we do, I can see a question, Graham,
Okay.
talking about the antivirus. I know the antivirus companies, they took a long time to figure out and to create signatures. So the question is, why didn't the antivirus pick up the threat when it was released? I suppose the answer is it's no, they didn't know that this vulnerability existed, so you can't create a remediation for it.
That's absolutely true. There's another layer though, because it's not just about that 0 day that no one knew existed. There's also the context of logging. Something that would be helpful in that scenario is to have a tool like a SIEM. SIEMs are a central management server that you take lots of data that is security related and input to. And then you could say, wow, why are all of my devices port scanning all of my devices? That's a really scary, non-conformant, non-standard event occurring in your environment, which would tell you that I don't know what's going on, but I know that I need to take action. And since we actually had a couple days when the port scanning started to when the vulnerability was exercised, that could have been a time for you to lock down your network if you had tools like that in place, which so many people didn't when the vulnerability was exercised.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot more education about how ethical hacking and bad threat actors actually try to access or hack a network. That you might have seen all this traffic before and not known what was actually causing it, but then thought, oh, okay, something's happening, but I don't think it's a threat. But now we would know because we've been through the experiences. And I suppose that's the risk you take if all you're doing is implementing a security policy where you rely on an antivirus only approach.
Yes. Yeah. Layered defense is the best defense.
100%.
Cool. So with that, I'm going to show you one of those layers in the process. Specifically, we're looking at the remediation, removal of SMB version 1 from your environment. And so here, right now, we're looking at the Syxsense console. I've kind of built out this environment to represent our manufacturing example. I have a whole bunch of devices here in the center of my screen. You can see that some of them are in my external organization right here. Some of them are within an organization called restricted manufacturing. and some of them are in an organization called users. And I want to know whether or not any of the devices in my environment are affected by SMB version 1 vulnerabilities. To do that, what I'm going to do is head over to my reports panel, and I am going to create a query that's going to narrow the scope of information that I'm looking for to just SMB related flaws. So here I'm going to select content, I'm going to go into queries, and then from there, I'm going to look at SMB version 1. Right here, you can see I've got 6 distinct results. Some of them are for Linux endpoints, so they're not going to be relevant to this specific effort. And then now that I have that narrowed scope, I'm going to click on the detected security vulnerabilities by site. This is going to show me my regions of devices that have SMB version 1 currently enabled, and maybe a couple other issues. Okay, so here we can see we have 4 distinct locations in our environment, 4 distinct networks that have devices that have SMB version 1 currently enabled. First, we've got that external region. This is probably the most dangerous. These are the devices that have the internet directly accessible as a barrier. So people from other networks can scan devices in my external site and see that SMB version 1 is currently turned on. Of the 5 devices in that network, 4 of them are currently vulnerable. Then we have my restricted manufacturing. These are devices that are behind an SDN network with a very firm firewall with a bastion host allowing communication from outside that network into that network. They do have SMB version 1 running on all 3 of the devices on that network, but remediating it would actually be a bad thing because we know what the risk is in this environment. We've created a mitigation against that risk so we can safely leave that environment alone. And then in my users organization, I have 3 out of the 5 devices affected. And frankly, we don't need SMB version 1 turned on in our end user device area. And then I actually have a surprise here. There's actually a device in my remote work from home users list that has SMB version 1. You're constantly going to find those scenarios where it doesn't make sense why it's true, but the report shows you the gaps that you didn't know you had. So there we go. Work from home users are affected. If I open it up further, you can actually see a list of assets and the specific vulnerabilities, because it's more than just SMB version 1. There's other SMB related vulnerabilities affecting these devices that I need to know about. So that's the context. That's what we have to work with. And we know that we have probably 3 unique areas of our organization that need to be targeted for remediation. And so to do that, I'm actually going to head over to the Cortex tab on the sidebar. And then here, I'm going to open up one of my folders and go to remediations. And here I have a couple that I've built. I'm going to select this SMB find and resolve. And just so you're aware, Syxsense customers have access to a library that we've built for you, providing you with over 400 distinct high and critical priority vulnerabilities that we can just remediate at scale on your behalf so that you don't have to design and build workflows for yourself. Here, we're looking at one that I've built for my environment, but we have many that you can deploy, including a custom SMB version 1 deployment model. So I want to make sure that the devices that are safe to remediate are remediated. And to do that, I'm going to select the Run Now button from the upper left. I'm going to choose a list of assets. I'm going to go into the United States. I'm going to go to Salt Lake City. I'm going to choose the external, the users, and I'm intentionally not targeting my restricted. And I'm also going to choose my work from home users that I didn't know were affected. And then here, I'm going to hit save and then run now. And what you will see is a process that's going to check in with all the devices that I've targeted and ask them, do you have SMB version 1 running? If so, looks like we do. We have a bunch that are currently affected. Okay, let's deploy a remediation. And it looks like we have a little bit of work with our process that I'll need to go through, but we're going to remediate all the vulnerabilities. And then if the remediation was successful, which I can diagnose why it's not successful through PowerShell logs, I can then reboot those devices, which will take the SMB version 1 out of the environment and then restore it to probably SMB version 3. And so that's the general process that you will go through to resolve SMB version 1 vulnerabilities in your environment. Any questions overall from the crowd about the process we went through? We'd be happy to address anything either to this workflow or to the larger scale conversation about WannaCry and vulnerability management.
Yeah, not that I have any questions, but we do get a lot of concerns and anxieties around, well, we've never looked after vulnerabilities like this before. We've always called it patch management. And as I was explaining at the very beginning, this isn't patch management. This isn't a vulnerability fix that was given by the Microsoft themselves, the vendor in this case, which was Microsoft, but you get 0-day vulnerabilities with Google all the time. You know, some vulnerabilities aren't ever patched. And this is a new concept that you have to take the vulnerability that you didn't know that you had. You have to decide whether you're going to remediate it. And I think what you've done there is you've shown that it is quite simple if you understand what you're trying to achieve, the devices that you do need to keep safe versus the devices that you accept the risk. And if you're accepting the risk, then you would need to put in place those mitigations. I think that's excellently described, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
And of course, you need to leave something proactive because you're resolving these devices now. And I think with the Cortex policies, you can have any new devices that come on the network within those regions actually proactively remediated as well. This is so far. This is so much bigger than patch management. And yeah, a lot of our customers that are using vulnerability assessment and remediation will probably find that they will need a lot of assistance and help to prioritize the most vulnerable of those 400. Yeah, Graham, thank you very much.
Of course, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Graham and Rob. This was great. We do have a few questions in the chat. The first one was back during Rob's explanation of the kill chain process. We had a question about network, firewall, and appliances vulnerabilities. Do those follow a similar process?
Right. So what's great about the Lockheed Martin kill chain is it's agnostic. In fact, the kill chain originates not with cybersecurity, but with traditional warfare. So the process is not for laptops and desktops or servers. It's for any classification of event where someone is attempting to strategically implement an attack against a target.
Absolutely.
Awesome. We got another question. In the Syxsense console, do we have a process for log4j fixes similar to what you did for SMB1?
Great question. Yes, we do. We have actually a few different remediations for log4j. I'm going to show you one example of that process from my environment, but I also know that Rob and his team have built some streamlined processes for specific versions of the vulnerability. Let me briefly just clean this up a little bit so it's easier to show. But what we're looking at here is a process that will scan for vulnerable devices. And then as those vulnerable devices are discovered, it's going to go through a process of alerting an administrator to found issues. In this case, we're looking at 5 distinct Java-related issues in Apache. If any of those issues are found, an email gets sent out with the name of the device that's affected. Then, now this is my policy, Other people might, instead of having it be an alert, they might actually have an email with a question saying, do you want to remediate these devices? I'm taking the liberty of just assuming that Log4j is severe enough that you're willing to bring down production. And so we're going to check to see if Apache is running. If it is, we will then turn off Apache, which is a bold move, I'm aware. So is Log4j vulnerabilities. We then deploy updates to Apache, which bring the version of Log4j from what I think it was like 1.2 up to 2.1 or something.
Hmm.
Then we validate those same vulnerabilities to see if they're still relevant on those devices. And assuming they're not, we will then turn Apache back on. We will then review the website that it's supposed to provide to make sure that the service is working correctly. And then we'll send a resolution email informing the admin staff, your SOC team, that the devices that were previously vulnerable to Log4j are now secure. And we can do that process in a matter of minutes. So the industry standard resolve time for Log4j is about 36 days, which is horrifying considering that the resolve time for the attackers is about 7. It takes 7 days for someone to find a device and implement their attack against the device on average. Sometimes it's faster or slower. This remediation, from the time that issues are found to when they're resolved, should probably take no more than about 15 minutes. So we're completely changing the paradigm around issues like Log4j or SMB version 1.
Thanks, Graham.
Of course.
Last question was, where can we find the Syxsense custom Cortex workflows?
Yeah, that's going to be a Rob question.
Okay, so from a Cortex engine perspective, we just want to take a step back a bit. So what you're actually seeing here that is something that has been customized by Graham for a particular outcome. And actually Log4j may just be simply, I want to resolve the vulnerability, or I want to take this approach of checking and double checking and alerting. Within the vulnerabilities tool, within vulnerabilities, we have created Cortex workflows on your behalf that we believe you want to take at a very minimum to resolve. So if you go ahead and search for Log4j, you'll find that there is one already prepared by us. And what we've done is to all of these vulnerabilities, and we have a database of well over 2,500, and we've taken individual vulnerabilities and applied fixes. So if you go ahead and take a look at one of the Log4j vulnerabilities, maybe the hash detection one, in the middle there.
Yep.
What we've actually done is we've created a solution which is to remove it. And actually what we've done is once a vulnerability is detected, we can then apply the solution and you can then approve it as you wish. But we also have another side. So we've got vulnerabilities that potentially you want to change your environment. It's not necessarily a vulnerability, but a concern you have. And we call these Cortex playbooks. And we've just launched it. So we're starting to build out inside the Cortex engine playbooks. This is not necessarily a vulnerability that you might call traditional vulnerabilities, but let's say your policy within your organization is to ensure every machine has a firewall turned on, or that their disks are encrypted. Not necessarily a vulnerability that you could assign to a CVSS score, but a policy nonetheless for your governance and security. And so within Cortex, we've now got a new section called playbooks. And within those playbooks, we've got those vulnerabilities that can be applied to customer environments to change the narrative, like Graham said, to remove one of the links that really would keep your IT manager awake at night if your environment got exposed.
Yep. Well put. Thank you, Rob.
Awesome. I think that was all the questions from my end.
That's
cool.
Brilliant. As I said at the very beginning, we really enjoy holding these masterclasses. We have some really exciting ones coming up. Please, if you have any feedback, anything that you would like us to cover, Any other vulnerabilities? I was going to say, did anyone want us to go into a deep dive for Log4j? Because that's really quite an exciting one.
Yes,
But it's understanding how the threat actors create the scenario and the story through this education. We hope that you understand that there is more to be done than just, as we had in the question, making sure every machine has AV. What if the AV is not working? You need a vulnerability detector that can find your AV that isn't running, turn it on, or reinstall it to keep your environment safe. So you have plenty of layers to ensure that you're protected. And once again, Graham, thank you so much. This has always been a fantastic masterclass, monthly webinar for me. I learned so much. I just want to say thank you very much for putting all this together for us.
Likewise, Rob, it's great.
Thanks both. We hope everyone has a good week.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everybody. Cheers.